Okay,
Okay,
very good.
thanks.
I'm gonna have you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Good
My name,
morning.
Morning.
my name is Rebecca, and I'm what they call an Uber judge. Whoops. This is my 18th year with IBEX. So I want to welcome you all. Before we go through introductions, I have to read from our fearless leader, and believe me, fearless this year under very trying circumstances. So this is the University of Massachusetts team, and the title is Artificial Intelligence and Bias, Implications for Human Resources Managers. So in this part of the competition, the long competition, you are taking on a fictional business identity and assigning fictional business identities to us, the judges. Please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are before you begin. You will have 25 minutes, and we're allowing a 5-minute cushion because of the fun technology to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem. I should say that even though legal comes first, and I'm a lawyer, this is really a business ethics competition, and a greater focus is on the ethical dynamics of the problem. And we hope that you recommend a solution that passes muster on all 3 levels. During that 25 to 30 minutes, you will be uninterrupted. When you are finished, the judges will query you for another approximately 20 minutes. And during the Q&A, both you and the judges will remain in character. After the Q&A, we will give you feedback outside the role playing. So some important things to keep in your minds. The ethical aspects of the analysis are the most important. These should be described in simple, practical, common sense fashion. Using technical philosophical language or terminology, or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds will be considered a serious weakness. During the presentation, each member of the team must have some sort of speaking role. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself in 2 seconds or less, and then ask the other judges to introduce themselves and their backgrounds. So as you can see, my name is Ruth Kraft. I was actually a judge in real life for 14 years in the New York court system. I'm now a partner in a New York law firm, and my specialty is labor and employment law. So I deal with human resources managers all the time. And this is usually the most fun 2 days of the year for me. Anyone next in terms of judges? I see Julie.
You got it. You got
Okay.
it. Good morning, everybody. Welcome virtually. So great to see your faces. My name is Julie Gershman. I am the Global Ethics Officer for Prudential Financial. I am also a reformed labor and employment lawyer, and my main colleagues at work are human resource professionals, employee relations folks, and of course, I'm very familiar with SHRM, and I am very excited to hear your presentation this morning.
Hi, I can go next. My name is Arina Demyanova. I am a part of the GSK Consumer Healthcare. It's a science-led healthcare company with a headquarters in UK. I'm Ukrainian and based in Warsaw in Poland. And I think that this format of the remote event has allowed me to be part of the team today. So I'm absolutely happy with the opportunity. And on a separate note, I have a legal and compliance background. Now I'm area director for ethics and compliance for the Central and Eastern Europe. And I worked as a legal counsel for many years as well. And also I'm quite curious about artificial intelligence and ethics with regards to machine learning, as well as the behavioral science. So the topic is really amazing for today. Thank you. Waiting forward to hear you.
And Rebecca.
Yes, thank you, Ruth. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Ream. I am currently a compliance business partner at Olympus Corporation of the Americas here in the Boston area, where I support mostly our medical device business. Before I came to Olympus a few years ago, I worked at the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, supporting global organizations, cross-industry with ethics and compliance. I have a training and education background. And in addition to my compliance role at Olympus, I am also the vice chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. So best of luck. It's great to be here.
Okay, are you ready to go, ladies and gentlemen?
Yep, I can start. Great. So thank you everyone for tuning into our conversation, again, on artificial intelligence and bias, and more particularly the implications for human resource managers. Again, we are presenting to the Society for Human Resource Managers, otherwise known as SHRM. We are Flagship Consulting. My name is Thomas Colucci.
My name is Malcolm Walensky. I'm the IT and Human Resources Consultant.
My name is Jessica Blanco.
I'm Luke Norton, Financial Advisory Services.
And my name is Noah Gelman. I'm the Risk and Software Consultant.
Right, so to get started, we'd like to pull a quote from a book by Thomas L. Friedman, Thank You for Being Late. The three largest forces on the planet, technology, globalization, and climate change, are all accelerating at once. So we're going to be honing in on this technology portion. And to start, we'd like to look at this Teller's graph, where you can see the exponential growth rate of technology and the line of human adaptability that's actually lagging behind. So I guess our first piece of advice is to take a look at this graph and know that our first step in moving forward to meet that graph in technology is actually being reflective and taking a step back to deal with these dynamic issues. So how do we see AI in science fiction today? You know, as you can see on the screen here, a lot of familiar faces. And a lot of the themes in Hollywood are actually, you know, the AI is going to have this evil persona and take over the world one day. You know, while that may be a future issue, we're looking at the issues of AI today. And the real killer of AI today is bias, as you'll see throughout the presentation. So just a brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about. Again, an introduction of what AI is, AI in business, AI and bias, the ethical considerations, AI and bias, in particular hiring, implications of AI, and the recommendations for best practices. Again, just some preliminary recommendations to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. For best practices: 1, establish ethical guidelines; 2, understand the technology; 3, enlist technology experts and have human touch points throughout the process; 4, develop strategies to limit bias; 5, include a review process for AI; 6, be transparent; and last but not least, be leaders in the regulatory process. So to start with an introduction of AI, what are algorithms? Well, algorithms are a process or a set of rules followed in calculations, especially by a computer, in which case you have an input and the computer gives you an output. Now, the pinnacle of these algorithms are efficiency. So that's what kind of we're working towards with AI, is efficiency. So what is AI? Now, I like to start this conversation with a man named Geoffrey Hinton, who was told at a very young age that the human mind actually works like a hologram. Now, Geoffrey Hinton is a neuroscientist in the field, and he's really enabling and engaging this conversation to the development of AI in business. So artificial intelligence allows computers to make decisions on their own with the help of algorithms, kind of like the revelation that Geoffrey Hinton had, just like a human brain. AI uses machine learning to determine these accurate outputs. And what machine learning really is when a computer takes vast amounts of data, interprets the results. So just a quick example of machine learning, you know, say you have the student John, who's the red dot on the screen, and he's being measured based on GPA and SAT on whether he should be getting into college A. Now the machine learning system takes all of the data that it originally has with rejected and accepted students, groups John together with rejected students, and determines that John is actually not fit for college A. One thing to note here is with more data, it could be possible that the machine can make a more informed decision. So you have John with the same academic credentials as before, in the same college, just with more data of rejected and accepted students. And in this case, John would actually be grouped together with the accepted students. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague here, Malcolm, who's going to talk to you about AI in business.
Thanks, Tommy. So let's move into it. So AI at scale is the next digital transformation. I mean, we're seeing really big global GDP potential and significant economic potential across the board. Namely, the beneficiaries are North America and China. But I like to sort of think about the investment right now is this study done by MIT. It sort of like categorizes it within 4 groups that are sort of investing in this new technology: pioneers, investigators, experimenters, and passives. And sort of pioneers and investigators are taking this more forward role in investing early, and versus sort of the experimenters and passives, which are taking more of a passive role on AI adoption. They're definitely waiting a little bit longer and wary of this investment. But if you're a pioneer and investigator, investing early can sort of widen that competitive advantage. And we're actually seeing that a lot of the investigators and pioneers who make these efforts are seeing way quicker impact to their business model. And the time frame of that is much quicker. But there's completely, it's interesting about the business value, because eventually everyone will be on it, but the people who get on it early are what, again, like getting ahead and sort of, widening the gap of that competitive advantage to peel away from people not implementing AI. But some of the, capabilities that we're seeing across the board in business, there's a lot, but to generalize them, sort of the automation, insight, and engagement of AI. Automation is sort of the, automating sort of back office administrative financial tasks to free up employees from more high value tasks. As well as insight is sort of, combing these like high volume amount of data to make new insights. And engagement is sort of the, chat bots or some kind of natural language processing system to sort of engage with clients or employees respectively. And some of the financial benefits, algorithms can sort of be thought about as revenue generating, sort of that big expansion, or cost saving. But the 2 main ones at the bottom there are improving the recruitment process, having some sort of system in place for that, and reducing human error to be more accurate with the models. Because a huge thing about AI is freeing up bias. But the thing about bias is it could paradoxically still creep in. So I'm going to hand it over to Jess to talk about the bias in AI specifically.
Thank you, Malcolm. So before we get into examples of AI and hiring specifically, it's important to understand some simple examples of AI that has been proven biased. Our first example is out of Compass. This stands for the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. This is a software that calculates and assigns scores to criminals, estimating their chance of recidivism. However, this has been proven to have a significant racial bias embedded in the algorithm. For example, African Americans are 77% more likely to be assigned to the category of a high-risk violent offender than their equal Caucasian counterpart. Additionally, moving on, we have an example about voice recognition bias. This is another example of racial bias in transcription softwares. An example of this is actually through the company Apple. Their software has a 45% error rate for African American voice transcription, while only 23% error rate for Caucasian voices. So here again, referencing back to Tommy's earlier point, diversifying data sets. The last example we have is the most prominent one, I would say, is the Apple Card that was backed by Goldman Sachs. This was a gender bias issue. The algorithm was putting out outputs where women were receiving significantly lower credit lines than men, 20 times lower in some cases. And this is a really big issue because when customer service representatives were asked why these numbers were being the outputs, there seemed to be no answer and no one really understood why. And then I will be passing it off to my colleague, Noah.
Thank you, Jess. Yep, I'm here to talk to you about AI and bias in hiring, really what's going on in HR departments today. So how is HR using AI today? One of their biggest uses is chatbots. An example of what a chatbot can do is look up company information or policies for current employees. They use AI to screen potential candidates. They're using it for virtual assessments of candidates, really in the early rounds of the interview process. They also use AI for automated resume review. They can use it to identify candidates based off public information like social media. So this AI is actually combing through a candidate's social media account instead of having a resource manager doing it themselves, and also providing learning and training to help employees while they're actually on the job. And HR is actually looking forward. They're actually thinking of more and more ways they can use AI every day. They want to increase chatbot usage for employee self-service. For example, if an employee has to change a benefit, they can do that with just AI. They believe that they can use AI to identify employees who are disengaged or at risk of leaving, potentially if an employee isn't really performing up to their ability, suggest openings or career paths for current employees in a current position if they're not currently happy. It can aid in the performance management process or improve benchmarking and compensation. Typically, these two processes can be very biased if a human is done, if a human does it. But if an AI program is programmed properly, that can remove that bias. And also virtual interviewing beyond that surface level assessment. So a lot of interns today, when they're and first round job applicants, they really have a first round virtual assessment, but HR really believes that they can go further and the whole process can be virtual. So just an example of where AI has been very successful in HR is Watson's IBM program. IBM gains insights from vast amounts of data to offer personalized recommendations, helps measure the degree of effort needed to fill an open position. It can predict the likelihood of candidates being successful in a given position. It can monitor social media to help recruiters improve messaging in that recruiting process. It can also help recruiters determine what they should focus on first while reaching out to a candidate. But on the other hand, we've also seen examples of where AI has experienced a lot of bias and thus not really helped out a company. And that has actually happened with one of the world's largest companies, Amazon. Amazon actually began developing a program to review applicants in 2014. Their models observed patterns in submitted resumes over a prior 10-year period. And the hope was really you submit 100 resumes and the program would spit out the top 5 resumes and then you would hire those top 5 candidates. But the system actually experienced a lot of gender bias. It continued to return more and more male resumes as opposed to female resumes. And this was actually because of the input data. Over the 10-year period, there was so much bias in the tech industry that the model actually taught itself that males were preferable candidates as opposed to females. So it's for this reason that bias is actually still a roadblock in full implementation of artificial intelligence in HR. We're still seeing a lot of discrimination towards minorities and women. These algorithms might perpetuate historical biases, and AI can actually mimic the bias of recruiters that help create a program. So if a human resource manager gives its opinion in order to code for the program, that bias could still be in there. And like as we saw with the Amazon example, discriminatory input data can lead to discriminatory outputs. So really one of the biggest issues is getting that good data. Now I'm going to pass it on to Luke for implications of bias in the use of AI in hiring.
Thanks, Noah. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about some of the financial considerations that we have at hand here. So really, there are 3 choices in this situation. The first would be to do nothing, not adopt any artificial intelligence, but possibly risk lagging behind competitors. Next would be to fully adopt AI without any protections in this situation, just to pilot some major human resource functions. And then the final option, which would be our recommendation, is to adopt an AI that reflects company values. So adopting an AI system that plays some part in these HR functions, but not an entire part. So firstly, with doing nothing, some of the pros of this solution would be that there's no immediate financial cost because you're not implementing a system. There's no risk of bias, again, because you're not implementing the system. And there's no need to hire the technical consultants needed to implement the artificial intelligence system. Some of the cons are major cons. You risk lagging behind competitors. You're really going to miss that AI train, and it possibly will hurt you pretty greatly down the line, leading to maybe some financial losses, and you still have to employ an entire human resource team. The next option, again, is just to fully adopt the artificial intelligence system without any protections. So it would create a quick and easy solution to many HR problems. Fewer HR employees are needed, and you are going to keep ahead of this curve, keep ahead of competitors. But it's going to be a major financial burden for you. This is not going to be cheap. You still need to hire HR technology consultants, and you're kind of at the mercy of the biases of the AI program, which could lead to possible litigation in the future, which would be very expensive. And then lastly, our recommendation, adopting AI that reflects company values. This would allow for some company values in the AI systems themselves, so you can work towards a system with little to no bias. It will allow you to stay ahead of competitors, have more efficiency in the HR department, and avoid litigation to keep you ahead of that regulatory curve. Of course, it's going to be a major financial burden pretty much no matter what, but if you want to stay ahead of this curve and stay up to par with competitors, you're going to need to hire these technology consultants to implement this type of program. And then really what we're looking at here is that the long-term benefits outweigh the initial costs. Of course, it's going to be expensive in the beginning, but it's crucial for the business survival to stay ahead of this curve and be involved in these regulatory conversations. So just if the company is able to create a clear, communicative process, it will benefit all aspects of the business moving forward, and it will help mitigate those possible major financial losses in the future. And of course, lastly, a lesser chance of litigation. Now I'll pass it off to Jess for some legal considerations.
Thank you, Luke. So not only is it important to think about the financial considerations, but it's also important to think about the legal implications. So to begin with, there really is no comprehensive approach to regulation and oversight of artificial intelligence use, but we are seeing a lot of developments around this. This is important because we really want to remain in the conversation about regulations when they're being formed. Also, another telltale sign that the move is coming for more regulation is that law firms are beginning to create artificial intelligence litigation teams. So this is kind of a predictor that there will be movement in this space. Moving on, a state that has taken a definitive stance on artificial intelligence is Illinois. They actually have passed a law that is related to automated interviewing softwares. This is just meant to increase transparency for candidates about what's really being used from their interviews. Moving on, Massachusetts has also called for a bill to be put into place for artificial intelligence, but this has not been put into action yet. It is just simply proposed. Similarly, our Congress has also moved to propose a bill in Congress about regulating AI. This is particularly regarding the Federal Trade Commission, just to have oversight about AI. We also have had a presidential executive order promoting artificial intelligence. So these examples just show that there is a nationwide conversation going on about regulation. We also have seen calls for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to regulate AI, not only the FTC. There's been a bipartisan bill proposed in Congress called the AI in Government Act. This is specific to the government, but it's really calling for AI to be used to benefit the public's interest. And it's also been supported by the Center for Democracy and Technology, showing that not only are government actors involved in this conversation, but also interest groups that are relevant. There has actually been a call for FTC rulemaking by EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center. This complaint is public and it's online for everybody to see. The concerns are about automated hiring softwares, and really their concerns about effectiveness of predictability. This is really a huge concern. And once again, we are going to see emerging litigation from this. There has not been any litigation thus far, but we will see it in the near future, we believe. We also need to think about our federal anti-discrimination laws, especially in regard to AI. In our case, we believe that we will be seeing a lot of disparate impact claims. It's not that the employer is intentionally discriminating against candidates, but it's the softwares that they use in the employment process. So we believe that that will be something that we really need to pay attention to. And we also have the EEOC having two complaints regarding this, but they are not public yet. So we will be keeping an eye on that as well. A really important law to pay attention to when we're regulating artificial intelligence is Title VII. This protects certain classes from employment discrimination, which is important when we're talking about the disparate impact claims. Additionally, we have a federal anti-discrimination laws regarding age and disabilities. These are both very important because some of the softwares just tend to inherently discriminate against these people. The issues with the ADEA and the ADA are very prevalent. For example, somebody who's blind just won't be able to have the same accessibility to the softwares as somebody who was not. So we just really need to take these into consideration when we're protecting those vulnerable classes. However, just briefly to bring this up, it's really important to incorporate privacy regulations as well when you're regulating artificial intelligence. So here we can see we have an example of a federal privacy law some from California at the state level, and then also an international level privacy law. This is probably the most important and the one that we should really pay attention to when we in the United States start to regulate artificial intelligence. The GDPR allows for hiring bias lawsuit protection, so this is something to really think about. So our final thoughts here is that we really cannot rely on the Constitution for a call to action for oversight and regulation, considering that the government is not the employer that we're really targeting here. Additionally, there really is that constitutional dichotomy between due process and equal opportunity. So that will really need to be balanced when we're coming up with regulations. And it's really important to stay in the conversation and to be an early participant in these conversations so that our values and what we believe is important is built into the regulations that come to be. So right now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Malcolm for some ethical analysis.
Thanks, Jess. So law is the minimum requirement for sort of ethics, but another requirement is the values, and specifically the trade-offs of those values. So moving forward, we're going to talk about sort of the predictive accuracy of an algorithm versus the unfairness factor. These are like kind of the two main variables, and we want to sort of strike a sweet spot or goal between the two if possible. So when we think about an ethical algorithm, it's sort of, as I said, the trade-off between the capacity for, predictive accuracy and some notion of fairness, some specific notion of fairness. So to ask yourself, how do I define a notion of fairness? You should ask yourself, who am I worried about protecting from some level of discrimination? Which groups? And what does that harm look like for my model? So a good way to think about it is sort of comparing the group ethics versus sort of individual ethics. And, the next slide will show that it's sort of, race, gender, and age are sort of part of that marginal attributes in group fairness. And then the individual fairness is sort of that combination of multiple group attributes for specific cases. So, we could protect against, race and gender, but specific cases with, for example, an Asian woman making, or above 20, went to college and making some sort of income, we guarantee at an aggregate level at the expense of individuals. So we really have to be carefully if we want to, protect from a whole race versus a whole individual sort of level. Moving forward, I like to think about these numerical trade-offs as on this Pareto curve here. So as you see, we have error, some amount of error versus some amount of unfairness, and you can't have one or the other because it will be, an imbalanced system. So you sort of have to strike a balance, and the most optimal sort of points to have these numerical trade-offs is along this curve here. Above the curve, you can maximize or minimize, the amount of optimization there. But you really have to think about, unfairness and error as a numerical trade-off. And where does your company, where does your organization stand on that? Do you want false positive or false negatives to sort of come from these models? What's harm look like? Is it falsely rejecting a qualified candidate in a resume process, vetting process? Or is it accepting a less qualified candidate in a resume process? You have to think about this and how it's in accordance to your values. Moving forward, start the conversation early. Get top management's attention. Plant those conversational seeds early. And then reflect upon, what are your core company values? Because you have to make this decision. Do not leave it up to the algorithms, the computer scientists, engineers, for these AI systems, because they're going to be biased. So you have to make those decisions and sort of take a step back and reflect upon your values. So these are some of the relevant stakeholders we thought. Of course, employees, HR, employers, respectively, shareholders, law, and society sort of at large. And when thinking about the duties and values on this in the next slide, we want our employees to feel like they have a fair standard of recruiting, an equal opportunity for job success and placement. But additionally, we want employers to implement accurate systems with more productive employees. And of course, we have the fiduciary duty to maximize the value of the shareholders, and as well as complying with emerging law, and ultimately, creating the benefit of society. Adding jobs or reflecting our sort of stance on ethics. Between societal social values, sort of like bridging that gap. So some of the financial benefits and costs from our sort of ethical standpoint is, if you're including some fairness, having fair standards of recruiting for employees. There's one, thing to mention though, is when thinking about the ethics in automated systems in general for hiring, you're definitely losing that human connection in interviews, making the impression, from human to human context. That is something to think about. But in general, employers, having accurate models, it's going to be expensive. For shareholders, you're going to have to take that that short-term investment risk and potentially fair little accuracy, lower models. But new value will come from that. And if you mitigate the future risks now, it's going to cost you in short-term legal fees, but it's going to ultimately create new job opportunities for society. And AI really has a lot there, and that's what we want to think about. I'm going to pass it on to Tommy for the final recommendation.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So last but not least, we have the recommendations for best practices with these systems. And again, I want to reiterate that this is an HR problem. This is not a problem in the technology realm. This is something that you're utilizing as human resource managers. So the recommendations again include establishing guidelines, understanding the technology, enlisting these experts, developing a strategy to limit bias, including a review process for AI, being transparent about the trade-offs, and participating as leaders in the regulatory process. Now to start, we'd like to recognize SHRM's values. Now these are the values that you are going to bring back to your home organizations, right? And I'd like to highlight the first one here that says adhere to the highest standards of ethical and professional behavior. Like I said before, the first step in moving forward in this process is actually taking that step backwards and reflecting on these values. So you want to understand the technology. Now, how do you do that? Research, 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 test, test, test. These are dynamic systems. They're not just a one plug chug kind of thing. You have to recognize that these systems are moving forward, and so should your training with your HR departments. Now, it's worth noting that Microsoft actually has a free software that allows, it's actually called AI School for businesses, for subscribers to Microsoft. So that's worth noting that, there's this cheap software available, there's these cheap trainings available for your organization already. This is really important in the cross-organizational communication process that should be throughout your organization holistically, not just your HR department. If you want to be more in depth with these systems, we do have technology experts handy, and some of the numbers for those experts here on the right side of the screen. You can see that each one of each of these specialists creating an AI department, so to speak, would cost upwards to $500,000, and we know that that's not financially viable for everyone, but it is available, and so are those free trainings. So at least some sort of implementation with these experts and this knowledge throughout your organization is worthwhile. Now, developing a strategy to limit bias, we take this three-step approach. 1, think ahead. 2, avoid or limit the use of third-party vendors if possible. And 3, test unfamiliar systems and be selective with vendors if it does financially make sense for your company. Again, think ahead, stick to your guidelines. The first step in moving forward is taking that step back, being reflective. Avoiding vendors if possible. This is, going to be the best way to avoid bias in these systems, because you have control of exactly what the system targets, but we know that that's not financially viable. So being selective with unfamiliar systems might be a good idea for you guys. Now, good vendors identify the same problems that you identify with. They allow you to start small and balance your growth with these systems, and they integrate human touch points along the way. Now, bad vendors we see pretty much the complete opposite. They lack testing and they have limited flexibility in terms of user agreements, with the example of Amazon's hiring tool, as we saw before. Now, we'd like to recognize Deloitte's use of third-party vendors. They're actually a company that is a good model for this. They're using HireVue, which has this broad data set, 1 million interviews, 180 countries, 700 partners, to really make it informative decisions in the hiring process. But Deloitte actually uses doesn't take advantage of their automated hiring system because they feel like there's some deficiency there in terms of bias. So it's interesting, and it's good to know that these third-party vendors are willing to work with you and accommodate just specific portions of their AI softwares. You need an ethics review process. Having peer reviews and audits are important. Establishing a compliance board, if possible. Again, having maybe even an AI department in and of itself. Seeking third-party certification, being having these incentive programs in place to be ethical in this process. Aligning AI techniques with company values. Again, I cannot stress enough, being reflective on your values is the first step to success. Now, transparency. Transparency is obviously a big thing. You know, publishing your process and values on an accessible forum goes a really long way. And we see that with Deloitte again in their publication for transparency. They have kind of this 4-step approach of how they're using AI in their systems, and it's a good model to follow. Last but not least, we have leadership in the regulatory process. You know, you want to be in control of the narrative for the future of AI and hiring, right? This is your future. This is SHRM's penultimate down the line. So, you know, more regulation is coming. You need to be sure that you're on top of that regulation. You're kind of driving that growth. That includes mandating review and supporting audits, and last but not least, promoting fairness, you know, and exercising leaderships that reflect your values as opposed to undermining them. At this point, we'd like to thank you guys for your time, and we're open to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, and right on schedule, I must say. I have only a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to the other judges. When you mentioned the criminal background checks and the potential for racial bias, to the extent that many states, including Massachusetts, New York, and California, have banned the box laws, which prohibit inquiries into criminal status. To what extent are you, unless your algorithm includes race, and if I'm correct that the assumption would be that hiring would be colorblind, then how do we enhance hiring of minorities and diversity in the workplace?
I can answer that. So yeah, I would say, well, first off, being in control of this technology is first and foremost, right? It's important to recognize that the algorithms in place have the potential to make decisions on their own terms, right? But if you as an employer want to see or are in an area where, you know, take minorities, for example, maybe there's a large Hispanic population in a certain urban environment, and the focus is hiring that Hispanic population. Incorporating that into your system is going to be up to you to decide. You know, you can have these algorithm specialists on board that are selective with those candidates. I know Malcolm mentioned those individual candidates before implementing these systems, and really having a small testing surface before going, I guess, at large with this software is really important. So there are precautions to take in terms of, you know, being selective with the people that you're hiring, and making sure that the computations don't act on their own terms.
Yeah, just to add on to what Tommy was talking about, yeah, like he said, it is possible to, you know, program these algorithms so it does take diversity into account. And we know that a lot of companies, you know, do have certain diversity programs when they hire right out of college. So it is possible to tailor these algorithms for those programs specifically, as well as a huge applicant pool.
I would also say, just to add to Noah's point, it's really important to have diverse data points to program the algorithms and to teach them how to learn, because that is often where the racial bias stems from. The example that Noah gave of the Amazon hiring tool, that's just one example of a gender issue, but that could also be seen in other racial implications as well.
I have a question for you, Jess. I believe you were the person who talked about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the ADEA, correct? Can't one argue that the use of AI as a hiring tool is quote unquote blind to issues such as blindness or deafness, because the individual applying and whose credentials are being reviewed online, given the technology available to the blind now and access for the deaf, doesn't that take the disability out of the initial equation? And is that not a positive thing?
I believe that here it's just more of an accessibility issue. A lot of these softwares are all completely online. So yes, there is technology that is meant to benefit those with disabilities. and obviously with the ADEA, just older individuals. However, we just want to make sure that these federal anti-discrimination laws are being paid attention to with the use and implementation of these AI softwares, just to ensure that instead of solving an issue, it's not perpetuating one. I don't know.
Yeah, I also would like to add sort of, if the concern is to protect people with disabilities, there are ways to implement sort of those attributes, like those attributes in your algorithm. So it protects sort of people who are blind, people who are this, people who are that. But you might,
but you're not allowed to ask someone in any phase of hiring, are you blind or are you deaf? So to the extent that a blind person has scanning technology and can respond, and a deaf person can read the questions and respond, doesn't that protect them per se? I mean, what you're suggesting, making the inquiry, would be illegal.
I believe here that we're just really focusing on the idea that we really need to be mindful when we're using these softwares, that there will be some sort of issues that arise, and that we just need to be ahead of the conversation with these. And we really need to make sure that since this is a newer technology and that it's not a face-to-face interaction, that these algorithms and the softwares are accessible to everyone, and that they don't unintentionally have bias in them. That's where the complaints came in from HireVue, is because their face scanning technology and the predictability of employment was up in question. So I just think it's something really to be mindful of. It's not necessarily something we need to be asking, because yes, that is illegal, but it's just something to be mindful of when you're thinking about incorporating these softwares.
When you mentioned the fact that the software had more difficulty discerning the accuracy of a Black voice as opposed to quote unquote white voice, does that same issue relate to people who are of European or Asian or South American ethnicity? Or was this only studied with respect to individuals who are Black?
This particular study was just run it was all of the transcription softwares from the main tech firms were analyzed, and the data that was proven was just in regard to African American voices compared to Caucasian voices. But that is just one study. I'm sure there's other studies out there that would.
Okay, Jennifer, do you have any questions? Do we have Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm the advisor,
Oh,
so I'm just watching. So I'm gonna.
Okay.
I'm
I'm sorry, I did not realize. Okay, Irina, do you have any questions or challenges for these intrepid young people?
Thank you very much, guys, for the presentation. It was extremely interesting for me to hear your, deep research with a huge amount of data. I have a few questions for you, actually. And the first one would relate to the point which you've made somewhere in the middle of the presentation. You said that the more data you get, the more informed decision you can make. And also you were talking about the privacy laws. So I would like to hear a little bit more on, for you to elaborate a little bit more about this balance between the amount of information you get for the sake of the more informed decision versus the privacy law and respect to the data which you're collecting from the applicant.
Yeah, I know, Jess, you have more information on the privacy laws, but I can help kind of tackle this. So it's obvious, it's evident that there are legal barriers that were mentioned earlier, kind of prohibiting the most informative data that we can have. And those legal barriers are properly in place, to protect the privacy of these individuals using the software. And I think that really speaks to finding that balance between, fairness and what we're actually able to do with the technology. And that's a very particular conversation that businesses should have on their own terms, given their certain, hiring pool. I know, Jess, you spoke a little bit about privacy laws, and you can touch in on this, but in my opinion, and where I see AI going down the line, it's going to get a little bit more invasive maybe in some of these areas. But I think, again, it's just being transparent about, maybe why exactly we're asking these questions, or having an option to opt out of some of these questions related to privacy, that can help the systems make a more informed decision in terms of bias, and making just that transparent, and making that very public, and knowing exactly why why we want this information from some individuals, and then again having that option to opt out of answering those questions at no detriment, might be something to consider.
And just to add something before you get into the privacy laws, when we're talking about data in this situation, so companies always are hiring, right? So in the Amazon example, they took their own personal data from the last 10 years. Those are resumes that they currently hired. We know that in huge industries like technology, banking, there has been so much bias. Usually there's a disproportionate amount of males that are hired over females, like in that Amazon example. But companies, in the 21st century have initiated diversity programs and trying to include as many different people in their hiring as possible. So that's their data. There are human resource managers, HR managers right now that are making these changes to the human biases that they have seen in the past, which means they're getting better data in their sense because they're including more people in their pool. So they have that data. So really that's the data that these companies are looking for in order to inform this AI in the future. The AI is really a tool, to help ease the processes that HR goes through. And as their own data goes through, as Amazon begins to hire more women, more minorities, their data is going to look more representative of what their workforce wants to be. So in that sense, they have that data available. So once that data is available based off the human decisions that are made, that will be able to inform the AI and the algorithms going forward. So I know, Jess, if you want to talk about privacy a little bit, but that is the data that I guess is technically owned by those companies.
So thank you, Noah and Tommy. But just really regarding privacy, we see that we have state level, federal level, and international protocols and regimes for individual privacy of your data. We think it's really important to really utilize these laws and to look to them for regulations that could be applied directly to AI, considering, off of what Noah said, that significant amounts of data are needed to train these systems and to improve them. So we really are calling for disclosure and transparency about how this data is being used and how it's being collected. For example, in the higher view cases, people were interested about how the face scanning technology takes data points off the face and how they're really used to evaluate candidates. That's just one example of how the privacy of the data really needs to be on an individual level, but also needs to be over the whole set of data. We really thought that the best way to really think about privacy and regarding AI is to look to the GDPR out of Europe. That is considered to be the most strict and robust policy for private data regulation. And it also allows for hiring bias lawsuits, and it has some provisions there. So we think that's really something that could be utilized for privacy relating to artificial intelligence. But overall, it's just something that really needs to be incorporated in regulation oversight, because since so much data is being collected and so much data is used to power these systems, it's just something that really, really needs to be pushed for and utilized when using AI systems.
Thank you very much. That sounds quite clear. And guys, one more point. You also said that actually your suggestion is for us to utilize the AI, but make sure that it corresponds to the values of our company. So me as a HR manager of a values-based culture in the organization, very curious about adoption of the artificial intelligence. But my question is more practical. If I'm not going to hire a group of the developers, and I wouldn't want to establish the department, and we are not financially ready for that, and we would go for the external company or the third party to develop a solution, how practically we can make sure that this organization will provide us with a product which ensures our values incorporated into the algorithm?
Yeah. So like I said, just to reiterate before, understanding the technology is the first step, right? So once you've honed in on a third-party vendor that you think at least might work for you, it's important not to take this vendor straight to market, right? To be able to test maybe some mock data, that you have and research really the company beforehand, third-party vendor that you're using. Again, being selective, it seems like it could be a short process, but in reality, it's really something that's long-term before, deciding to implement. I think, again, research, test, that should all happen beforehand before actually using these third-party vendors with your own data sets.
Additionally, I just was going to say, or to reference back into our slides, you could look at the Deloitte and the HireVue example. HireVue's come under some scrutiny for their practices, but Deloitte takes their own approach to using their softwares where it's more tailored to their company specifically. So there's definitely modifications that can be made just to make sure that if you're using a third-party vendor, that the software aligns with your values and what you're aiming to use it for.
Okay. Julie, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I was wondering whether, I have a few questions, whether you're recommending certain processes are better suited for machine process learning and AI and others are not, right? So are you recommending more chatbots? Are you recommending resume snakes that help you recruit? And the second part of the question is, are you advocating for the use of third-party data? And if so, what kind of controls are you advocating for? And then would you like SHRM to take a position on this? Or are you informing SHRM here on their own hiring practices? So 3 parts, some processes versus others. Are we taking data from somebody else? How are you going to handle co-correlates in that data, right? And are you asking SHRM to take a position, or are you asking us about our own practices?
So yeah, I guess the first part, to answer that, the way that we've studied AI is kind of collectively in the machine learning process, and we find benefits and costs with each individual implementation process. So there's not a specific, mode of AI that we're recommending you use. But we're just saying that throughout the system, at a high level, there's this potential for bias, and no matter which type of software that you're using, you should be careful. And then to your second question, I'm sorry, could you just actually repeat the second question for me?
About data.
It was about the data. Are you recommending that we not only use our own data, but that we pull data from public and other sources? And what are the problems associated with each of those?
I could talk to that. I believe that. So I think, at take like a big multinational company, right? The human resource department really knows what type of employee they're looking for and what they want their employee makeup to look like. So just kind of like Amazon used resumes over their 10-year period, kind of like kind of something similar. But now that we've moved towards a more inclusive environment, they'll be able to use that data, but the data has to be used with consent of the people applying, obviously. So we do see some cons there because the data could be biased in the past, but also the pros is that you're able to, choose the type of data that you want out of your employee makeup, as opposed to if we were to use, public data. Again, a con there is that that's not reflecting the values and the employee makeup that you are going to want at your own company, depending on where you're getting the data from. Another pro that I could see there, however, is that you could get like more amounts of data than you could at your own company. But we suggest really using your own data with consent if that data is really going to be what you want your company to be made up as. Again, you have to look at that as a company. Like Amazon didn't look at the data that they put into their processing system and realized, but once they realized what the system was overturning, then they realized what that data really looked like.
Yeah, so let me interrupt you there for a moment. 2 points. One, Amazon's data was only in testing. It never went into production. Want to make sure we're clear on that.
Yeah.
And 2, I question whether if we look back 10 years and we think about the future of work, are we hiring for the same things? We might be hiring for the same values, but we are probably hiring for different skills. So I do want to challenge your assumption that looking back on what we needed to make us successful over the past 10 years will also make us successful over the coming years, given your technology graph at the beginning of your presentation. More of a statement, not really a question.
Yeah.
And and then the last, I know you had one more point there.
You can go, Tommy.
Sorry, no, my fault. Just to the last point, we're looking for managers in the SHRM network to kind of take this information and these recommendations back to their home organizations. So this has a more broad, I guess, scheme. This isn't just a SHRM thing. This is really an industry-wide, across industry rather, issue that is incorporated in every business perspective. So just for that last point.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
All set, Ruth.
So it's odd because the next one for me is St. Thomas at 12:30, and I've just gotten two conflicting emails, one from Robbie saying that it's on and one from Tom that it's not. So let's operate on the assumption that we have another 10 to 15 minutes for feedback. Well, first of all, congratulations on participating despite the technology or lack of same, because obviously Zoom has its limitations. I have grown to hate it in the last few days, especially in multiple calls, because I can't see all of you at the same time, unfortunately. And I'm getting lots of feedback here on my phone, and all my devices are lined up here. I have to say, this was a very fine presentation. First of all, you were all evenly ranked. You're all stars. And sometimes we don't see that in teams. Sometimes we see one person being very dominant in a team as opposed to others. And I thought all of you were absolutely spectacular. Your graphics are superb. They obviously took a lot of effort. They enhanced, they did not overwhelm, nor did they detract. I think you hit exactly the right balance on the use of the graphics. And you're all very, very articulate. You certainly covered the ethical dimensions. I would just say from my perspective that I would have liked to see those slides involving the ethical dilemmas and the identification of the stakeholders to have come earlier in the presentation rather than, I think, probably 2/3 of the way down the line. But I thought you did a very good job. And, you actually, I have notes to myself, financial costs. Well, you actually addressed them. Every time I came up with a question in general, you answered it before I had the chance to ask, and that's also a wonderful thing. So I think, you were to be congratulated tremendously. Are you all undergraduates or MBA students?
Undergraduate.
Undergrads, yeah.
Okay. And anybody not a senior?
I am not upcoming.
Me neither.
Two of you. Okay, so you may be back next year and live and in person,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, the hope.
As opposed to virtual. Julie, do you have comments?
I would love to comment. Thank you so much. This is a huge topic. And I think you covered such a wide variety of materials in an appropriate level of depth for the time frame that you had. The areas that you may want to focus on moving forward are you speaking with global companies or domestic companies? The majority of what you focused on was domestic, although you did focus on GDPR at some point as having stringent criteria. The CCPA also has that, as does the Polish law and the Argentinian law. I think with technology comes great things, like you can have some notes in front of you. We can see you read when you do that. So, you wouldn't have done that in person, but this was kind of like a real crazy experience. When you look at the camera, you should actually look straight into the camera. People can see your eyes. They can see you move around. They can see all that. You guys have good setups. You may want to consider raising your computers up so they're not kind of looking up at you, but they're more level with your eyes. It helps with the connectivity with people. As Ruth was saying, the technology can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. I did have a question about, you guys talked about whether AI can be used for engagement and to determine if people are engaged, keeping in mind that people engage in different ways. You have introverts, you have extroverts, you have people who take care of others. You have people who are on disabilities. And when you start amassing data about how people work to determine if they're engaged or not engaged, you can build in bias in that. I think we could also acknowledge that bias exists in human interactions, and all technology does is scale it. right? And so we already have bias. It's not like we're creating bias. We're just scaling it. I just think you guys did a fantastic job. And Jess, I think I saw you 2 years ago. I'm not really sure, but I think I did. And I think you know someone just like you. Legal issues also, which I found interesting. Huge amount of material. You have a few lawyers here, a bit intimidating, I imagine. The one pointer for you in particular is you have a window behind you, which makes you backlit. And I think if you're going to do this again in the next few days, make sure that window, either you're facing the window or you've got a wall behind you. Thank you again. Fantastic. And Jennifer, your team was great. I'm sure you're missing seeing them in person, but this was really great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Irina?
Without repeating, guys, all the compliments which you have received, really amazing. I'm impressed. I just wanted to give you a few pieces of the constructive feedback, if you don't mind. So your slides were amazing. You captured a lot of information, very rich research, and I could see your passion around all those areas of the artificial intelligence and hiring. But think about the fact that sometimes less is more. You could take some of those areas and lead us a little bit deeper into that, allowing more reflection instead of running through all. But then again, it depends. Maybe that was an intentional decision to run us through all the areas, but just have a thought about that. So less is more, and including the slides, how you put together the slides. Your pace was quite fast. You were moving one slide after another, and it was very passionate and interesting, but not always everything which you captured there I could reflect on. So think about maybe putting a little bit less there and a little bit of a verbal context behind those statements. Thank you. Thank you so much, and good luck.
I think we have one more judge, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you so much, Ruth.
I'm so sorry that
no problem. The challenge environment here.
Your face didn't come up at all, so I apologize.
No problem at all. Thank you so much to this team. I think it was a great presentation. I echo what everyone else said in that. I think you were very prepared, great slides. I love that you started with the why. Why should we do this? I would echo also, Irina, that I felt your pace was a little too fast at times, and I didn't have time to read all the slides. So I would definitely suggest a little less content on slides or fewer slides so that we can focus on the most important information. The other thing I would say is you had a lot of great research and information about where bias exists and making sure that we're keeping up with technology, the why there. What I was hoping to hear was, what is the why on why we should have diverse workplaces, and what's the return on investment? Because coming from a business perspective, that's what leaders are asking. Okay, we really want to focus on diversity and we think it's important and aligns with our values, but please tell us the actual research that shows this will improve our workplace. What is the return on that investment? We want to do it. We just want to be able to, show those numbers. So I would encourage you to, think about some research on that. But otherwise, great job and best of luck.
Thank you. Did you have any questions for us? I don't know if since you didn't get to ask any, Rebecca.
I was just going to ask about that research. Okay. That was my main thing.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for participating. We wish you the best of luck on the 10-minute and the 90-second tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you did a remarkable job, especially you're not even in the same place, right? You're all in your own homes, I assume, safe and sound.
Yep.
Not an easy time. We live in interesting times. Anyway.
That's true.
Yeah. Hopefully, now we've got everybody on the screen. Thank you, Robbie. Hopefully at some point, hopefully by next year and by the time that all of you are getting ready to start your postgraduate work and or jobs, things will be better. Hopefully things will be better. That's what we can all hope for, right?
Right.
We wish you much success, and congratulations on an excellent, well-rounded presentation. You have a lot to be proud of, and you can't shake each other's hands or move around and shake our hands except for
virtual hands.
Right?
Elbows, yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great day. Good luck with the rest of the presentations.
Yeah. Well, the next